All right, this gentleman in the red shirt.
Right. I wanted to ask Mr. Wallman, and I think a few people have chimed in about the difficulty of forcing entities to retain risk, coupled with the question of kind of transparency or the understanding of risk by the smaller players whose individual risks are then aggregated by these companies. One great concern I have about a consumer financial protection agency, which, you know, the flip side of that coin is Fannie Mae. In a way, I mean, it was a policy, you know, to accomplish a certain thing for consumers or to help them in a way to gain housing in what was theoretically a good, understood by the government to be a good policy way. And there might be some tension between Fannie and a consumer protection agency, but I'm very concerned that the consumer then, under the auspices of such an approach, would be the one who was essentially forbidden to have risk, while inevitably, you know, larger entities are going to be more rock in the river regarding risk, and so we're not going to let anybody borrow individually money where there's not evidence they can pay it back. That frustrates the capital flowing to the smallest level, while I just can never see that happening at the higher levels.
And I think the questions you raise are questions about what is it that you would regulate and how would you do it. These are almost the identical phrases, almost the identical debate if you go back and look at the legislative history and the debates with regard to the establishment of the SEC. And the issue there was, well, will the Commission have the authority, for example, to ban various securities and not permit them to be sold to the public? Will the Commission be in a position that will regulate what the rates will be on various securities in terms of how much they can be sold for, or other kinds of things? And the debate went back and forth, and folks finally said, you know, we're not looking for somebody to say we think this is a good stock or a bad stock, although there were blue sky laws and there were blue sky commissions, Massachusetts, for example, being the famous one that thought that Apple was too speculative a security for people to buy and therefore banned it from being sold in Massachusetts. But you've got the ability for regulators to say, no, we're not going to try to second guess whether or not this is a good or bad security, but we are going to make sure that there is at least full and fair disclosure with regard to when it is sold, how it is represented in terms of its facts, what the benefits are, costs, et cetera, of that security. The same thing can apply here. So I think it's a question of what is it that this agency, were to come into effect, would in fact do. And those are, I think, very, very reasonable things to debate. I think they go to the heart of the question of whether or not I'd say good idea or a bad idea. And we have different regulatory agencies that act in very different ways. The Food and Drug Administration has a very different view. It doesn't simply go out and say, here's a bunch of disclosure. It says, we're not going to actually let this drug be on the market because we don't think, no matter what the disclosure is, people will be able to understand it, at least in certain contexts. And so if it's not safe and effective, it can't go on the market, period, even if somebody believes that it might be. Others have argued even that goes too far, and some people will disagree. The question, therefore, isn't one of whether or not, again, the agency as an agency makes sense in the sense of should there be some protection for consumers. The question is, how does that protection actually get implemented? And I think we can agree that were it to be implemented in terms of better disclosure than there has been, that would be probably a good thing. I think we can also agree, at least I would take the position, that should the agency start to say, I don't think mortgages that are going to have potentially more than 8% interest rates on them in this environment are permitted, and therefore we're going to prohibit any mortgage that might have an 8% kicker on it, that would be a bad thing. So I think it's a question of what is it, not a question of whether or not conceptually it makes sense to have some kind of consumer protection. It also relates, I think, back to the question that was raised previously, which is not defining in terms of the quantitative amount of systemic risk, but is government basically part of the systemic risk problem itself? And there are two ways to look at that. One is simply, do you have too much power on the part of government? The second is, does government create its own contagion, moral hazards, et cetera, with regard to consumer protections or otherwise? And I think the answer is obviously yes. We've seen governments in many cases go overboard and structure economies in ways that are horrible, and those have fallen. We've also seen countries, we've got them around the world today, where there aren't governments that are strong enough to do much of anything, and those are horrible too. So the question is getting it right. And we've always tried for Goldilocks in this country. Sometimes we succeed, sometimes we don't. But it's a question of, again, trying to evolve the ability to regulate well. You know, it's interesting to me because in almost every other sector, we don't assume that cars are as good as they're ever going to get, and now we can just stop, or that anything else is as good as it's going to get. We shouldn't assume that regulation in government is as good as it's going to get. We can continue to aspire to make it better. We can learn from the past, we can learn from the mistakes, and we can make it better. And I firmly believe that there is a role for government in this area that can actually improve the lives of everybody, and that's something we should aspire to.
Thank you. Our time is almost up, so since we only have one questioner left, we'll try to get that in. If you could be very brief.
Thank you. I'm Henry Weissman from Los Angeles. My question is, what's so bad about risk? I thought that reward follows risk, and I thought that's one of the things that makes this country so great. So, and in fact, looking back on these financial events, it seems like the problem wasn't too much risk, but too little risk. People thought that they weren't taking risk. As Dr. McTeer said, the banks thought that these were low-risk investments. So in that context, I'm confused by why our government is establishing policies that seem to be designed to discourage risk-taking.
Take it? Go ahead. I don't think anyone up here is saying that the government should have policies designed to discourage risk-taking. So at least I don't know if anybody has a different view, but I don't think any of us are suggesting that. I think that would be a mistake.
It's a question of managing risk.
Exactly. I mean, people want risk understood. They want it better disclosed. They want it in terms of the entities for which taxpayers may be responsible at the end of the day, better understood and better managed. But I don't think anybody wants to say that it should be discouraged. That would be a terrible mistake.
It's overly simple, but in this thing, the question is not people creating risk for themselves, but people creating risk and then offloading it onto unsuspected other people. That's what they're trying to get at, I think. That's certainly what was happening in the subprime mortgage area. Risk was being created, and they just handed it off to people that didn't understand it.
Okay. I think we're pretty much out of time. I would like to thank all of our panelists. I think it's been a very interesting discussion.